Welcome, everyone. My name is Ed Tephorn. I am the Executive Director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We are so excited and delighted to have our conversation and author spotlight tonight with Pornsak Pichetshote, who is the writer for the Good Asian comic book series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I wanted to just share a little bit of information about the Immigration Station Foundation. The focus of the foundation as a primary nonprofit partner for Angel Island State Parks is to help raise funds to support the preservation and renovation of the buildings at the National Historic Landmark on Angel Island, as well as to provide cultural and educational programs that help to promote the histories and stories of immigration, both through Angel Island as well as after Angel Island stopped serving as a U.S. immigration station. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, just very briefly, the history of Angel Island is that from 1910 to 1940, there was a former U.S. immigration station that was built to enforce the exclusionary immigration policies of the time that started with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and with subsequent laws and policies expanded to include most people from Asian and Pacific Islander countries who as laborers were barred from entering the U.S. and for those who were able to enter the U.S. were barred from becoming US citizens. Over 500,000 people were processed or detained or interrogated at Angel Island, and they came from 80 different countries around the world, but mostly from Asian and Pacific Islander countries. And this is all history that you might already be familiar with if you have read the Good Asian comic book series, because in the comics, Pornsak has had the opportunity, and thank you for that, Pornsak, for writing in bits of the history of Angel Island's immigration station to give your readers context about what happened at Angel Island. And so while many people might be familiar with the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island and how they stand as symbols of welcoming of immigrants, primarily from Europe, what Angel Island reminds us of is a darker chapter in US history where specific groups of Asians and Pacific Islander immigrants were deemed to be unacceptable and not welcome in the US. And that's why they were forced to go to Angel Island as they tried to prove who they were as immigrants and their opportunities and abilities to contribute to American society. Angel Island today stands as a reminder of this dark chapter in US history and is hopefully a symbol of allowing us to continue to think about how we treat immigrants then and now, and to perhaps imagine a current day or a future day in our country where, regardless of where we were born or what language we speak, that we're all treated with fairness and respect. So that's just a very brief history about Angel Island. And we started this author spotlight series to have an opportunity to take these stories from yesteryear and draw connections and parallels to what's happening in terms of immigration today. And part of what we are interested in doing at the foundation is to utilize different mediums of storytelling, of arts, of cultural programs to help lift up not only the histories and the facts and the data, but also the emotions, the themes, and the stories. And that's why I'm so excited that we have the opportunity to connect with you, Pornsak. Welcome to tonight's Author Spotlight.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. This really is an honor. I'm really excited to be here.
For those of you who are not familiar with Pornsak's work, it's my pleasure to welcome him and introduce him back. Actually, we had an opportunity to do a Facebook Live fast chat a couple of months ago, and this is an opportunity for us to continue the conversation. Pornsak, like myself, is of Chinese Thai American heritage, but he is the writer of an amazing comic book series that has been getting so much positive buzz called The Good Asian. Pornsak was previously at DC's Vertigo imprint, where he worked on some comic book perennials such as The Sandman and The Swamp Thing. And he even has Hollywood credits to his name, including writing and directing episodes of Light as a Feather, Cloak and Dagger, and Women Who Eat Meat. So, Pornsak, before we delve into your series, The Good Asian, we typically like to start off these author spotlights, giving our authors and writers a chance to just share a little bit more about their backgrounds. And so I had a couple questions for you in terms of what it was like for you growing up, both here in the US as well as in Thailand, as someone of Chinese Thai American descent. So that actually is the very first question. What was life like for you growing up, given these multiple identities that you hold?
I mean, it was definitely tricky. I mean, the trickiest thing for me was when I was 12, sort of the family kind of moved us back to Thailand. My parents moved us back to Thailand, and I spoke very rudimentary Thai. So I went to an English speaking school, but most of the kids there were Thai, and so I really had to kind of pick it up quickly as I went. And that was interesting, I think, too. You know, there's certain themes that you key on early on in life, and you wonder which is the chicken or the egg. But for me, this whole, and you know, you see it in the book as well, sort of this outsider looking in. There's aspects of that, you know, being Asian, growing up in a white suburb, I sort of felt that. But also as an American kid growing up in pretty much a Thai culture, I kind of felt that too. And you get sort of an outsider's perspectives on things. You get to sort of question things people take for granted. So I think that is probably the biggest sort of impact it had on me, as well as, you know, how much language can kind of be a barrier, because it took me a while to learn Thai living in Thailand.
So do you speak Thai with an American accent like I do?
Probably. Honestly, at this point, my Thai is very bad. I joke, and it's not even a joke. I know just enough to know I'm dumb. So like someone will say, go get the noun from the noun. And I know they asked me a question. I don't know anything enough about it to be actually useful.
I can navigate my way around a menu, but
That's it. That's as far as I can go too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason that I don't speak Thai as well, though, is growing up in Texas in the 70s and
Oh, sure.
80s. My parents experienced a lot of racism and
Yeah.
xenophobia because they spoke English with an accent. So there was a point where they actually stopped trying to teach my brother and I how to speak Thai so that we could speak English and be as American as possible. And I know you grew up in the East Coast. Was that similar for you, or?
You know what? What was funny was it's funny that you mentioned that about accents, because I kind of had the reverse of when I went to Thailand. Accents to me were such a sensitive topic, and I think it had a lot to do with growing up in America and just the way an accent kind of stigmatized you in a certain way. So that when I moved back to Thailand, even though I knew some Thai, I didn't speak a word of Thai for the first year that I was there, and so everyone assumed I didn't know Thai. But I just wanted to make sure I got the accent right, and I think a lot of it came from growing up in America, where the idea of like you get put in a certain box if you have an accent, and I took that with me to Thailand.
Right. And the Thai language, like Chinese, is a tonal language. So
Yeah.
depending on the tone that you use, you could actually be saying the same word in different tones and having
It,
it mean different things, right?
yeah, it's such a complicated language. There's 44 consonants, 22 vowels, and 5 accents, which, like you say, can completely change the meaning of a word. So it's such a confusing language, and it definitely took me a while. And I've forgotten so much of it now, but it definitely took me a while to kind of get used to it.
Yeah. I mean, even like the word ma, ma, ma,
Yep.
ma, right?
y-
So it could mean horse, dog, come
Yep.
here, or
Yeah.
mother,
Right.
depending
No,
on the tone that you use. So you want to make sure you get the right tone.
it's so confusing, and like vowels can happen to the right, below, above, to the left, and you need to know the rules of every vowel to know which direction, which order you read things. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that is on my bucket list of things to do is to learn how to read and write Thai and to improve my accent. But I know that that is going to be many years in the making.
Yeah, same here. Same here. I was a lot better than there was a while where I could read a newspaper, and that when I was in high
Wow.
school, and now I can't. Now I've forgotten too much of it, unfortunately. I wish I knew it better.
Well, speaking about reading and growing up and learning things, right? I bet almost every kid dreams of growing up to write comic books, but at least in my family, that was not necessarily one of the career paths that my
Oh yeah.
parents encouraged. So,
No.
can you share with our viewers tonight, how did you get into the comic book industry?
I mean, I fell ass backwards into it. But that said, I grew up in exactly the household that you're talking about. My parents did not, comics were a waste of time. I
Right.
remember, summer of my freshman year of college, I was reading Moby Dick on my freshman year, and was feeling very proud of myself for reading like Moby Dick on my own. And my mom came there, it's just like, and my mom entered my room and saw me reading it, and she was like, "When are you going to read a real book?" Because in her mind, textbooks were real books. So comics did not have any value at all. And so I started down the route of being a screenwriter, going that way. And what ended up happening was I got a job as a comic book editor. I wasn't looking for a full-time job, but uh, an editor by the name of Karen Berger, who started the Vertigo imprint, which was an enormously influential imprint for me. And she was editing all my favorite writers. She was looking for an assistant editor. And so I answered it into the call. I didn't think I wanted a full-time job. I went through a couple interviews. I went through a test. And eventually I was like, you know what? I think I'll work this job for 6 months to learn what it's like on the other side of that desk. And 6 months kind of turned into 10 years, 10 to 11 years. I spent 7 years as an editor, and then I came out here to LA to become a television executive, all for DC Comics. And the whole time, I didn't really know how to explain what I did to my for a while it was just like, I work in magazines because that's better than comics. And for a while when I was a TV exec, and that's the other thing too, like my parents and my dad like did not understand what being a television executive meant. So it was kind of like, do you write the shows? I'm like, well, no. Do you run the company? He's like, well, no. It's like, so you're middle management? I'm like, yeah, let's go with middle management. Middle management sounds exactly right. And I think slowly it got to a point where they understood like whatever I was doing, I was happy with it. But I get asked a lot, like, how did you tell your parents you were working in comics or writing comics? And I was like, I don't know if I ever did. Like, I just was doing it. Eventually they picked up, like, they'll hear I have a book out. And, oh, it has pictures in it. I guess Pornsak's writing a comic. Like, that's kind of like the path in which this stuff goes.
Right. Almost that process of coming out to them as a comic
Yeah,
book
totally,
writer. Right?
totally. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like I never actually had the conversation. They just kind of picked it up through context.
Got it. Well, I've got a couple more questions for you that focus in on the Good Asian series, and also hopefully you can give our viewers tonight a little bit of the inside the writer's mind aspects of some of the thinking behind the series, and definitely want people who are watching to know that this is meant to be an interactive session tonight. So if you have questions for Pornsak, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box or to use the chat function, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So Pornsak, to start us off in terms of delving into the Good Asian, for those who may not have had a chance to read the Good Asian series yet, can you do maybe like a little quick commercial summary of what the comic book series is all about?
Sure. The Good Asian's a genre I'm calling Chinatown noir, and it's a 1936 detective story in the style of Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, and it's about and features the first generation of Americans who grew up and came of age under an immigration ban, the Chinese. So it's about a Chinese American or Chinese Hawaiian detective named Edison Hark, who kind of comes to San Francisco Chinatown in search of a missing girl that's connected to his surrogate white family. And in the course of looking for this missing Chinese maid in kind of classic noir tradition, he stumbles on murder, he stumbles on a conspiracy, and that reaches up to sort of the highest reaches of power. And it's kind of a way to use that crime noir genre that I love to talk about Asian American history that I think we've forgotten, and sort of, the roots of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the roots of how the Chinese were treated, in terms of immigration, that would define the way America would treat immigrants going forward, and it would it would establish the machinery that we would use and the vocabulary we would use to talk about immigration. So it's doing all that, hopefully in a fun crime noir thriller.
That's awesome. And exactly what you're saying. So many of these histories are unfortunately repeating themselves when we look at not only the exclusion laws, but also the detention that happened at Angel Island. We definitely had experiences at Angel Island of children being separated from their families, children as young as just in single digit years old who were detained on Angel Island. And then just the interrogation, the lengthy detention process, the cramped conditions. There's so much about the detention that happened at Angel Island that we're actually seeing again, for example, along the southern border today.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the Good Asian series, not only is the writing and the storyline amazing, but the illustrations are absolutely beautiful as well. And I'm going to put on the screen so people can see some of the artwork from the Good Asian series. So here we see some of the covers for some of the initial volumes.
So that's Dave Johnson on the left there, who's our regular cover artist, and Sana Takeda, who also does a book called Monstrous, and I'm a huge fan of her. So it was such an honor for her to do a cover for us.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the stories of these covers? What messages you were trying to convey with these covers?
I think the big message that we were trying to convey for that first issue, for Dave's issue specifically, is we want to get noir, and we wanted to sort of get that immigration, illegal immigrant, immigration ban across. And Dave is one of the smartest, the most talented artists. I was a huge fan of his. He was I think his most iconic work is probably a book called 100 Bullets, and I was such a fan of his covers there. And the great thing about Dave was he was his ability to, kind of like an editorial cartoonist, encapsulate ideas in a single image and then still make them sort of striking. And the thing that I kind of love about both of these covers, when you see them side by side by this, is one of the reasons I love working with Dave is he comes from a Western influence. He knows the history of the pulps, he knows the history of design, and it filters in his design sense and in his cover sense. Now, Sana lives in Japan, so she comes from like an Eastern background. And the thing I really love about these two covers, when you put them side to side, is that the covers from the Western background are about the individual. It's about Edison Hark and the man in the detention center. But if you look at Sana's, it's about Chinatown. It's about the location, the community. And when I look at these covers, to me anyway, it's such a testament, and they speak to each other about sort of that crossing the roads that you find as an Asian American. That this you have this Western tradition that's more about the individual. You have the Eastern tradition that's more about the environment. And where do you stand in that Venn diagram connecting? Like, where do you sit between them? And I love that, we didn't give direction for Dave to just be more about the detective and Sana more about the environment, but that's kind of where their natural instincts led because of the traditions of art that they kind of come from. And I just love looking at these two covers for that reason.
When you are putting these covers together and you're putting the comic book series together, I'm curious, if, given your identity as someone who's of Asian American heritage, are there a lot of writers, illustrators, editors who are Asian American in the comic book industry?
There are editors. There are writers and artists. Cliff Chang is probably, has a book out actually this week, a Catwoman book out this week that's amazing. And he's Asian. He introduced me, actually. He's Chinese. He introduced me to Alexander Tefengji, who's the artist on the book. I can think of people like Jessica Chen, who's an editor at DC Comics. Darren Chan, who's an editor at Marvel. So there are sort of Asians sort of in the sphere. But, for a long time, this isn't just comics, but pop culture in general, when we talk about Asian influence in comics, it is more about Asia. And part of the impetus about the good Asian is to acknowledge Asian American history, that feels like that kind of gets lost because of the more exotic elements of Asian and Eastern sort of histories and cultures and all that. And so that was a big part of the book, of just doing something that actually acknowledged Asian American history, and specifically what that history is. And so you can kind of see what its effect on us today has been.
Right. And we definitely appreciate you helping to bring attention to Asian American communities. Definitely, when I think about the history of Asian Americans, and even media images and stereotypes and narratives about who Asian Americans are today, it always feels like that there's three primary narratives or lenses or stereotypes that our communities are forced into, right? So one of being the model minority, where we're all well-educated and wealthy, or secondly, that we're the perpetual foreigners, where it doesn't matter how long we've lived in the US, we're not considered as being fully American. Or that third one of just being invisible or whitewashed.
And part of the book, very much part of the book, was to address all those boxes that we kind of get forced into and try to sort of assert sort of a new place for it. Like, for me, I wanted, I love movies like Shang-Chi, and I love like Kung Fu movies, and I love wuxia movies, but I wanted a character that was Asian American that didn't rely on martial arts or, mysticism. I wanted that to exist. And I wanted him to be tough, and I wanted him to be sexy, just because I'd never seen that before. The closest I think I got was like Dustin Nguyen on 21 Jump Street. And I still remember he was like the first Asian I saw on TV with abs, so it was just like, those are the little things that kind of influenced sort of the creation of Edison Hart.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember growing up in the 70s and 80s, there were not a lot of Asian male role models, right?
Yeah,
That we had. I mean, we had Bruce Lee,
yeah,
but oftentimes, if we saw anyone in a movie or a TV show,
yeah,
they were a martial artist, or they
yeah,
were the cook, or they were the foreign exchange student
yeah,
who didn't speak English. And most often, they were not seen as like the protagonist, the
right,
hero, the romantic love interest. They were kind
yeah,
of like the side characters,
yeah,
or just the sexless, unattractive
yeah.
characters.
And I remember, being disappointed like during the 90s, during the Hong Kong movie phase, and watching, people like Chow Yun Fat and Jet Li kind of come over, and even then they would get their own movies, but even then they wouldn't be romantic leads. And so stuff like that, I kind of wanted to sort of, reassert sort of a place for that kind of character into sort of pop culture history, and noir was a great place to do that. So much of this for me, I did not know. I learned relatively late about the Chinese Exclusion Act, not coming to high school in America. It was not taught to me in high school history. And so I learned about it really late. I learned about it just 2016, and I learned about it because my father had been obsessed with China growing up, or not in his later years. He'd been obsessed with China, and so when he passed away, I started in sort of dealing with the process of dealing with his loss. I started getting interested in the things he was interested in, and that eventually would bring me to Chinese American history, which would get me the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I was shocked that I didn't know about it. I was shocked that I didn't know about the Immigration Act of 1924. And specifically because I had this pop culture addled brain, I thought it was crazy to me that, wow, at a time when Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto and Mr. Wong Detective were really popular, Asians couldn't enter the country. And that kind of became the seed of me thinking, like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to do one of those Asian crime solvers, but acknowledge the actual Asian American history of the time? And right now you have the art, you're showing the art from Alexander Tefenji, colors by Lee Lowridge, letters and design by Jeff Powell. And it's so gorgeous. They're such a great team. Alex specifically is such a wonderful, I mean, they're all wonderful human beings, but I knew Jeff and Lee before this project. I got to know Alex during the course of making this project, and now we talk every 2 or 3 weeks. And he's such a wonderful person, and so kind and so gracious, and you can just tell how hard he works on the page. The art is just gorgeous.
Uh, Absolutely. The artwork is so stunning and so compelling. And what people are seeing on the screen are some of the initial pages in The Good Asian One, Volume One, that follows a really beautiful vignette where we're first introduced to your lead character of Edison. And
Yeah.
he's actually in detention at the Angel Island Immigration Station, and has this very kind interaction with a 12-year-old boy in detention. But then when we next see him, he's in this situation. Can
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit more about what's happening in these panels?
In these particular panels, he's on the trail trying to find Ivy Chen, who is the missing maid that he's been tasked to find. And doing that, he has to sort of work with one of the cops at the time, who was somewhat racist. And in this particular page, what you'll see is that what we learn is that Detective O'Malley, who's the cop on the scene, feels that the whole family is acting edgy, and they're hiding something, and they think they're hiding sort of the whereabouts of Ivy Chen, and he thinks they're lying to them. But what they're actually hiding is the fact that they kind of know that Dad has opium in the apartment, and Dad is completely willing to let his whole family go to jail and possibly get deported, then give up his opium stash. And so Edison here finds himself in a position of, the only thing he can do to help the family is by selling out the dad. And that's kind of Edison's whole thing of being. So the thing about and so much of Edison Hark was based on, or I shouldn't say based on, but inspired by Changa Perna, who was the first first Chinese American cop in America. He was also the inspiration of Charlie Chan. And one of the things I find so interesting about him and his life and his career was that when he was a police officer, he was tasked. They didn't need Chinese cops to sort of give you tickets, to write you tickets. They needed Chinese cops to go undercover into opium and gambling dens, and figure out who the troublemakers were and report back to the cops when they raided it, because no one would expect a Chinese cop. And so in that sort of sense, Chinese cops were used against their communities, even at the same time that they were kind of the bridge. They were meant to be the bridge in terms of like, you can kind of trust us, but they were weaponized against their community themselves. And that to me struck me as two things. One, sort of like classic noir, damned if I do, damned if I don't sort of dilemma to put a protagonist in. But it also felt as an externalization and a dramatization of that conflict, that inner conflict I find as an Asian American, I think other Asian Americans can relate to, of straddling both worlds, straddling two cultures, and trying to figure out who you are without betraying either of them. And so it's one of the reasons why I was particularly drawn to sort of Edison Hark and Edison Hark's sort of conflict.
I love how you described that feeling of essentially being torn between two countries or
Yeah.
torn between two worlds. And for those of us who identify as being parts of marginalized or oppressed communities,
Yeah.
and holding maybe multiple identities, whether it's because we're multiracial or because
Yeah.
we are gay and Asian or because we're Asian and female, trying to navigate the perceptions and norms of what the different parts of our societies try to impart on us, it can be so challenging at times.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing too. There's a piece later on in the book where a character by the name Lucy Fan, all she wants to do is perform and be a singer at a nightclub, but her dad came. Even though her dad's never mentioned it and won't mention it, she's pretty sure her dad came in with fake papers, and so she's terrified that if she does anything to create a certain amount of attention, she will that it might endanger her father. And so she has a monologue where she's just like, she doesn't know how to be. She doesn't know how, she doesn't know how to be strong and silent and strong the way a good Chinese sort of woman is supposed to be. And it feels like whatever she does, she is betraying something. And it's and Hark kind of finishes her sentence. And part of the reason that exists there is to show the fact that even before Hark became a cop and became this, he understood what it was like to constantly feel like you're betraying something just by trying to be the person you want to be.
As we move into some of these follow-up questions, you actually started to get into this, Pornsak, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more. What was your inspiration behind developing the Good Asian series? Because it is fairly unique in terms of its approach and how you try to develop not only this combination of the noir and the fiction, but weaving in the historical aspects of it and working with the historical research team to make sure that your facts that you were portraying were accurate.
Well, I mean, honestly, a lot of it comes from the fact that, like, growing up and even as an adult, so much of the stuff that I learned comes from pop culture. So much of the stuff I learned came from comic books. So that's a little bit wired into my DNA already. And, I think a lot of it for me was, the fact that, I mean, I did so much research about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act 1924 just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it, because I had such a hard time believing it existed. And it's funny for me to say now because I've done so much research into it, and it is such hard. But at the beginning, I had just assumed I was getting facts wrong because I couldn't imagine the fact that it existed, and I didn't know about it. I didn't know the ins and outs about it. So that was, but that was part of a bigger thing too, which is the fact that I alluded to it earlier. There's so much about Asian American history that we've forgotten. We've allowed ourselves to forget, and that isn't part of our conversation. And it's been interesting. I feel like in the moment that we are now, we're at this place where pop culture and entertainment is starting to acknowledge Asian Americans and sort of integrating them into sort of the conversation. And it comes with this bigger question of like, okay, so what is Asian America? There are so many different groups that aren't even connected by language. What commonalities do they have? When you're talking about Asian Americans, what are you talking about? What themes are you talking about? And one of the things I think is interesting is that's a little, you're writing in wet cement right now. That I don't think anyone's really settled on what it is, and everyone is doing their best to try to define it. And so the Good Asian, I do feel lucky in the sense that the Good Asian gives me the opportunity to take part in that conversation and give my 2 cents. And part of my 2 cents comes from the fact that there's this history that we have not acknowledged, and it's what people have asked, like, why did you choose this particular time? Like, why not 1882? where the Chinese Exclusion Act just landed. And for me, it was, well, 1882, then it's a Western, and it looks too different from our world. But the thing that was interesting to me about 1936 is that it's a noir, it's something we're used to seeing, and yet there's this entire side of it that we're not, that we don't acknowledge, that's been invisible to historically to most of us, to me at the very least. And how does that sit alongside the classic Americana stuff that we are very used to? And so that's part of what I wanted to integrate here, because I thought that was interesting. And the idea too, of a generation that came of age underneath an immigration ban. And it was funny, like the book became very relevant when we launched it, because so much anti-Asian violence was happening at the time. But when I pitched the book, I thought the relevant aspect of it was going to be coming up underneath the shadow of an immigration ban, and the questions the book asks about immigration, I thought were going to be the relevant aspects of it. And that turned out not, or it's still the case, and it probably will continue to be the case, but it was much more the anti-Asian violence aspect of it that really made people pay attention to the book. But for me, it was about that. It was about acknowledging the history that I wasn't aware of, and to take a genre that we all know, and to acknowledge these aspects of it. And that was one of the reasons why it was important to have someone like Grant Dinn on board, because I do a ton of research and all this stuff, but Grant kind of checks all my math. He reads all my scripts, he reads all my proofs, he checks the art, just to make sure that what we're telling is the truth, what we're telling is accurate, because the goal of the book is to have everything that we do not contradict history, to be able to sit side by side with history.
And Grant is an amazing historian. He's
amazing.
Formerly on staff at the Angel Island Immigration Station
Yes.
Foundation, and he's someone who we also continue to partner with.
Yeah.
We've been working with him on a new permanent exhibit that will be launching this coming Sunday.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it's
That's
focused on the Japanese American detention
right
during World War II. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, leading up to Executive Order 9066, there were about 700 Japanese and Japanese Americans from Hawaii and the West Coast who were briefly incarcerated on Angel Island before they were moved to other camps across the country.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's that history that I know we're trying to lift up. And I want to say thank you so much for your efforts in helping us to promote the history of Angel Island. When I saw, I think it was The Good Asian Volume 2, you had several pages that were dedicated to explaining the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, pictures from your trips to do research out at the Angel Island Immigration Station. And I've never seen that in a comic book before. Yeah. So thank you for helping us to spread the word about this important chapter of U.S. history.
I mean, everyone at Angel Island has been so, like, from my very first research trip, everyone has been so gracious and has been so helpful and has been so committed to getting information out there. It's been a dream. It's been a dream to work with.
So I've got one last question, and then definitely want to then start to move to questions from the audience. Sure. So this is just a reminder, if you have any questions for Pornsak, please feel free to type those into chat or into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So my last question for you, Pornsak, is actually about your character, Edison Hark, the Chinese-American detective, the protagonist in your series. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. Growing up, who did we see, right, in comics or the media or in movies, who were Asian males, and the ones that we did see were often very one-dimensional.
Yeah.
So how did your experiences of that lack of seeing ourselves represented inform your approach to creating these wonderful characters like Edison, who are very fully developed and aren't one-dimensional? So Edison and the other characters in The Good Asian.
I mean, it informed them in every possible way, in the sense of I wanted Edison and the characters in the book to represent characters I had never seen. And so much of that was pushing against stereotypes, but pushing against sort of, like I wanted to see, and that's why noir was a great genre for it. I wanted to see a flawed Asian character. I think part of it is pushing against the model minority, but I think also too, we're at this strange sort of point now in pop culture where networks and studios want more representation and want to acknowledge the diversity in America and in the world more in their entertainment. But because there still aren't as many parts, there's still a hesitancy of being like, oh, I don't know if that Asian male character, I think we need to like that Asian male character more. I think they can't do anything wrong and he needs to do that. And I have a problem with that, because I think despite the best of intentions, what you're actually sort of saying is, it's a model minority myth all over again of, well, if we have people of color who are virtuous and at their best, we can put them alongside flawed white characters. And so to me, equality is more, we can explore and we can embrace flawed white characters, but we should also be able to embrace flawed characters of color. And so that's what, a lot of that went into Edison Hark, the idea of having, a strong, sexy lead who is conflicted, who was haunted, which again is, I watch a lot of Hong Kong cinema, and that's not novel and that's not innovative at all. But to do that and actually acknowledge that person and his Asian American roots was not something I saw a lot of. Bruce Lee was sort of always sort of the foreigner, when I watched his movies. And honestly, it was like the first I saw of it was, Dustin Nguyen in 21 Jump Street, and, him being sort of an undercover cop, and they acknowledge his, the fact that he was a Vietnamese immigrant and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of it was just like seeing that, and all the other characters too. It was taking a look at like what I didn't see in pop culture and trying to, inhabit that and have this world acknowledge that as best as I could.
Yeah, I remember one of the first Asian characters I remember seeing on TV was Sulu, right, on the Star Trek series.
Yeah, totally.
But again, he was not given the same leadership opportunities that the other characters were given.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So here's the part in our author spotlight where we now turn the table over to our audience for them to be able to ask questions of you. And we've already started getting a couple of questions coming in. So please feel free to continue to type those into chat and Q&A. The first is from Julie, who shares a comment with us. So important to distinguish between Asian America and the exoticism of Asia and the outsider foreign shadow cast on all Asians. The Asian diaspora is far and wide. Thank you for this program. Thank you for your comment, Julie. And I think as I'm also thinking about the stereotypes that are cast upon our community, the same way that Asian men are desexualized and demasculinized in many historic media portrayals of Asians. The opposite is true for Asian women, where they become hypersexualized and turned into almost a fetish object. And that has real world implications for the women and girls in our community.
Yeah. And it's all, and all an aspect of the same aspect of othering sort of Asians. And so you take Asian American men and you desexualize them, you take Asian American women and hypersexualizing them. And I think part of the goal is to just readdress that balance.
Exactly. The next question comes from Jerry, and he asks, which genres, works, or authors inspire your writing? And he's really curious to hear more about how you transitioned from the horror supernatural genre in Infidel to the crime, noir, thriller, mystery genre of The Good Asian.
It's a lot of it has to do with I have a great editor. My editor, Will Dennis, is one of the best comic book editors working. He's also one of the best crime editors working. So he edited books like 100 Bullets and Scalped and DMZ, and he edited a whole crime line of books, and he's done books that aren't crime as well. He worked with Scott Snyder on all his books, but he's such an aficionado of crime fiction, and much more so than I was. He actually recommended my first Chandler novel to me ages and ages ago, and kind of started me down this path of being obsessed with crime fiction. And so it's been great to have him sort of as a backstop. And I think the other thing too is part of the way I work is Infidel was taking a horror book in sort of the haunted house genre and embracing the tropes and seeing the tropes as opportunities to use those tropes as lenses to talk about the world. And one of the things I learned from Infidel was that I could do the same thing with other genres. And so with the noir genre, and a lot of it, and this Infidel was like this as well, so much of that is where you pitch your tent. That if you pitch your tent in the right soil, so many of the decisions of these decisions, these parallels become natural. So, once we landed with noir, there was so much, okay, we have a flawed protagonist, he's burnt out, and these are the reasons why. And then it filtered into so many of the so many aspects of the characters that ends up being commentary about Asians and Asian American history. But also is very faithful to the genre itself. And so Infidel kind of helped me with that, of learning like, okay, this is the power of tropes, and this is how getting something familiar is strong, and then you can kind of subvert those tropes along the way, and they have an even stronger effect. It's kind of like a cover song in that way. How the song goes, but you can do little runs here and there that feel so much stronger as long as you keep the basic melody happening. So that was so those were the lessons I brought in from Infidel to The Good Asian. And honestly, so much of the process was the same. Infidel, I do a lot of research on all my books, not just in the nonfiction aspects of it, but in the genre aspects of it. So if I'm writing a horror book, I'm watching a lot of horror movies, I'm reading a lot of horror comics. If I'm doing a crime book, I'm reading every crime comic, I'm watching movies, I'm reading a lot of books. So, for something like The Good Asian, there was a lot of Dashiell Hammett. There was a lot of Philip Marlowe, Raymond Chandler, Lou Archer, Ross McDonald, Easy Rollins, Walter Mosley, but also Asian American detectives. Leonard Chang has a Alan Choice trilogy of novels. Henry Chang has Inspector Jack Vu. All that sort of stuff kind of filtered in, and it was inspiration for the book.
Got it. So the next question is from Roger, and he notes that 2021 is the 80th anniversary of his favorite film noir, The Maltese Falcon.
Oh, yeah,
and
nice.
So he's really enjoying your great Edison Hark work. He loves the genre. Chinese actor Ki Luke got his only shot as a real Asian detective in the 1940 film Phantom of Chinatown.
Yeah.
And it's been 80 years since Edison Hark was introduced by you. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. Thank you.
We've got a question also from Jeff, and he wants to know, what are the similarities or differences between writing for comics versus writing for TV? Is the process different?
It is. There are similarities and differences. The main difference to me, the way I look at it, is that if you look at television, if you look at comics, they seem very similar. They're both, from a certain distance, they're both vehicles that will take you across terrains and landscapes and vistas. But if you pop the hood, they run on completely different things. So for me, comics runs on conceptual ideas. It runs on concepts. That's one of the reasons why I think so much media, film and TV, comes to comic book adaptations, because there's so many ideas in sort of a comic book. And it's a medium where, because you can control time, I can read, and this happens a lot if you're a fan of a writer by the name of Grant Morrison, or Neil Gaiman, where they'll give you a caption, and that caption will be so interesting you'll stop for 30 seconds and think about just that concept that was in that in that caption, where you can't do that for film and TV, because that's a medium where you can't control the time. If you get distracted, the story will move on, and then you'll have to race to sort of pick up. So as a result, to me anyway, comics run on conceptual ideas. Television runs on emotion. It runs on it runs on interaction between characters and those sort of big emotional moments. Now, and by that I should say, a mediocre comic can string a narrative behind conceptual ideas, and you get a pretty decent comic. You don't get a great comic, you get a decent comic. You can do the same thing with television. You string along big emotional moments with a narrative, you get a decent episode of television. It may not be a great episode of television. And so knowing that, for me, when I'm working on a comic and I want there to be an emotional moment, I then, because I know that emotion isn't necessarily the first language of comics, I have to structure an entire page around conveying an emotion. In the same way that if I'm writing television, I construct an entire scene about explaining a concept. I can't just expect on the page, I don't have an actor to say a line a certain way and make you, get the feels. I have to, it's a very constructed thing I have to do to give you the kind of emotion I want you to give, whether it's shock or sympathy, or if I want you to tear up or laugh or any of that sort of stuff. It's very, very calculated. Whereas with television, it's a little bit easier because you have actors and you have music. But on the flip side, for television, you don't have that with conceptual thinking, and you really have to, lead the audience by the hand if you're going to introduce a concept to them.
Right. And no spoilers, but at the end of volume 4, there is a hugely emotional moment that caught me. I was tearing up reading
Oh, good.
it.
I'm glad.
And so, yeah, I won't give anything away, but encourage people, if you haven't gone out and read the series, you've got something coming up in volume 4 for sure.
That's awesome. And just so you know, those first 4 issues, they are available now on trade paperback, on Amazon, in bookstores, in sort of like volume 1, which incorporates, I think, the up until that 4th issue that you're sort of talking about. So you can find that at sort of bookstores everywhere right now.
Great. Our next question is from Daphne Kwok. Hello, Daphne.
Okay.
Daphne was actually one of our former executive directors at the
cool.
Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. And she shares, thank you for this fascinating conversation into a new medium to inform Asian American Pacific Islander history. Do you know who your readers are? Are they primarily AAPI? Are they non-Asian American Pacific Islander?
You know what? I feel like it's hard to say if I know exactly who my readers are. I definitely have non-Asian readers. I definitely have a lot of Asian readers. I mean, it's one of the challenges of putting a book out during this COVID era, where it's all just tweets and write-ups online, which is great. I know that, I definitely know that we have both readers and fans in both. It's harder for me to sort of say how much of the pie is one or how much of the pie is another. And then honestly, that's one of the things I look forward to doing in-person events, which, I've just started to do. I'll actually be in San Francisco at Comics Experience on this Sunday from 12 to 2 for a signing. And I look forward to these things because, now that the world is opening up a little bit more, I can actually see the people who are reading the books.
Right. So if you're not coming out to Angel Island to see the opening of the new Japanese American exhibit called Taken from Their Families, make sure that you visit and get your signed copy of The Good Asian with Pornsak
Do one of those
Comic Experience.
Do one of those two at the very least. Yeah.
And Daphne just ended her question with the comment that it's so empowering for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but also educational. And that seems even more important today to help us bridge understanding between our communities and other communities.
Yeah. I think a lot of it for me, discovering this history, really for me gave me a context to who I am and why I feel the certain things that I feel and all that sort of stuff. And that to me was the first. I didn't come into it with this intention necessarily, but I realized it was sort of the first step of, if we are having a large culture-wide conversation of like, what are Asian Americans? I found it very helpful to say like, oh, this is what brought us to this place. This is why, if there is a slow simmering anger, this is where it comes from. If this feeling of neglect or invisibility, this is where, these were the very calculated moves administrations made to make that happen.
Exactly. So as we start to wrap up tonight, Pornsak, just two more questions for you. One of them is, as you think through the experience of putting together The Good Asian, what have you enjoyed most about this process?
I honestly, it's working with the team. I mean, Alex and Lee and Jeff and Will and Dave, they're very, very good friends. And it's the best part of making a comic. I don't have a lick of musical talent in me, but I have to assume that this is what it's like playing in a band, because it is, you're doing something creative, you're putting it out there, they're responding to it. They add something to it, you change what you do based on what they do, and it's this big creative conversation. I love making comics. I love the people who make comics. Comics, it's a medium that's sort of built on love. You don't go to comics to get rich, and as a result, the people who are decided to become professionals on this thing that is built on love it is not shocking that they are lovely people, and I love working with them. I love talking to them. I love hearing their stories.
As you mentioned teams, I just have to give a shout out to my team member, Russell Nauman, who's our operations manager, and he's helping to manage this tonight's Zoom session from behind the camera, if you will. But he's also responsible for much of the graphic design and social media that our followers see on our Facebook and Twitter. So definitely makes a difference when you have a team
Yeah.
that you enjoy working with.
Yeah, absolutely.
To your last point, in terms of given that people don't necessarily go into the comic industries to get super rich, but for those who are interested, what recommendations that might you have for those who are interested in pursuing a career in the comics industry?
Oh God, pursuing a career in the comics industry. I mean, that is tricky. There was a friend of mine actually started a very vibrant Twitter thread about like, can you survive in comics without a second income? So many people I know who come to comics come from another medium and build off the success of another medium. And even I started off as an editor and then became a television exec and kind of used the nest eggs I built there and the contacts I built there to sort of make comics. The one of the things that if you can draw, it gets a lot easier. If you can draw, then there's nothing stopping you from putting words and pictures on a page, putting them out in Kinko's and, Xeroxing them, going to Kinko's, Xeroxing them, putting it up. Gene Yang started off that way and just by putting Xerox copies of his comic on the shelves of Eastwind Books. And now he's a MacArthur Grant genius, fellow. And if you can draw, that the world is your oyster, and then it's just about putting just being diligent. If you can't draw, it's a little bit trickier. Then you have to learn how to become a friend of artists. You need to learn how to champion artists and be supportive of that community as you try to find the right people who are willing to work with you. And some of them, and there are different ways to do it. There are some people who want who won't charge you anything up front, but want co-ownership with you. And that's a perfectly valid response. There are people who are less concerned about co-ownership, but they want, some pay up front. And that's a different response. We do both at Good Asian Land, at Good Asian Co. And I think, but I think the main thing though, is if you want to write comics, the first thing you need to do is really appreciate art and be a fan of art and be not just a fan of artists, but be a champion of artists. And that'll get you the other half of the way. Part of the challenge, I think, anytime someone asks me, how do I make a comic? I don't actually know that answer. But if someone asks me, how do I be a comic book writer? I do know that answer. And that is make yourself part of that community. And whether it's reviewing comics or running organizational things around comics networks, it's a small community, and and in any industry, good people find good people and good people work with good people, and slowly, and everyone in comics, I used to part-time at a comic book store. Everyone in comics, their first thing was never comics. They were always trickling around some way in comics in some way, shape, or form. It was part of their social circle, and it just becoming a comic book professional means really embracing that comic book ecosystem, and that is a lot easier than just making one comic, which I have to admit I don't know how one actually does.
Thank you for that very honest answer.
Yeah, no problem.
So, Pornsak, you get the last word. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you want people who are watching to know about either your journey or about your work on the Good Asian series or what's next? Or
I'm just really grateful. I'm really grateful for the time. I'm really grateful for anyone interested in the book. Like I said, it's available on Amazon and in comic book stores. Issue 6 with our David Cho cover, which is like one of my career highlights. I have a cover by David Cho. That actually comes on sale this coming next Wednesday, because it's Wednesday today. Next Wednesday, that goes on sale. So the new issue, and then there are issues of issue 5 still in comic book stands. And the trade that is on Amazon and on bookstores right now will collect issues 1 through 4. So you definitely have a chance to catch up on the whole thing. And and other than that, I just really appreciate the time.
Well, thank you again, not only for joining us tonight, but for all of your previous work and for helping to lift up this important history again of what happened at Angel Island and its connection till today. So I look forward to continuing to read the future volumes and learning more about what happens to Edison Hark.
Thank you. Thank you again for the time. Like I said, I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. And for anyone who's watching, if you enjoyed tonight's session, we are a nonprofit organization and we're only able to bring events like this to the community with your support. And so if you are interested in making a donation and supporting the foundation, you can go to our website at www.aiisf.org/donate, and we'll type that into chat for you. Also, we appreciate your feedback. So if this was a program that you enjoyed, or if you'd like to see us do different things for our future spotlights or future programs, or if you have recommendations of authors or writers that you'd like us to approach and potentially feature on future events, please take a moment to fill out the feedback survey that you'll be receiving via email shortly after this program closes. And as an extra incentive, every quarter we are doing a drawing for a $50 gift card to the California State Parks gift store to also support our fellow California parks. We'll do a quarterly drawing of all the people who respond to our feedback surveys in those given 3 months. And finally, we invite you to stay connected to us as well as to Angel Island. It truly is a beautiful place that has such an important to remember history. So if you're not already following us on either Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn or YouTube, all of those social media tags are on the left-hand side. And definitely also please follow our partners at Angel Island State Park, and all of their social media handles are what you see on the right-hand side. So with that, thank you again, Pornsak. Thank you, all our viewers, and we look forward to seeing all of you on our next Author Spotlight series. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.